Hello and welcome to Letters Home. I'm your host, Annie Whitlock, and this is our premiere episode. This podcast is a serial story of a World War II B-17 pilot from Lowell, Michigan, in his own words, and he just so happens to be my grandpa. I'm joined by my co-hosts, my dad, Mitch McMahon, and my aunt, Lori Summerfield.
Hello, yeah. In each episode of Letters Home, we're going to dive into the letters written by my dad during his time in World War II that he sent back to his parents, his siblings, friends back home in Lowell, Michigan. And we'll be reading his own words and giving some context as to what's happening in the world and in Lowell at the time he wrote these.
I wanted to mention that Lowell historian Dale Croft came across these letters, and he was very adamant that an electronic copy of these letters should be made to preserve the history, and he offered to undertake this project, and Dale will talk more about that. But once the electronic copying was completed, Dale began compiling historical artifacts to connect with the content of Dad's letters. And we're doing this podcast in a large part to draw attention to Dale's incredible work and direct folks to the lowellmuseum.org site. And this is our first episode, and we thought we'd start by introducing our main character, my dad, James Bruce McMahon, and give you an overview of the project the Lowell Historical Museum has done to capture his story.
So, Aunt Lori, the story somewhat, to me, starts with you in a way, but tell us how these...
Kind of a cool, unique box, and on occasion I would just go down and take out a letter and read it, and then I found that it was really, sometimes they were about my mom, sometimes they were about the war, and I'm not as much of a history buff. I have to admit that. My mom was, but... So then I would bring them out when the family would get together, and we'd all kind of giggle about it and look at these things. And then I remember saying to my son a long time ago when he was about 12, Quinn, can you scan these into the computer? Oh, no, Mom, that's way too much work. And there's a lot of them. There were a lot of the letters. And so I just left it alone. But we discovered it, in the basement, which was kind of fun.
I remember reading them on occasion at family gatherings. I think I tried on his bomber jacket one time.
Yeah.
So there's more than just letters in your basement.
Yep, there are. Yeah.
I used to wear his bomber jacket when I sang in our rock and roll band, The Plague.
Gotta get a plug in.
Gotta get the plug in. When I sang Sky Pilot.
Sky Pilot.
Yeah, that was...
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. Well, even though his first name was James, Grandpa was always known by his middle name, Bruce. He often signed his letters Bruce or J. Bruce. So we'll hear during this podcast, we'll talk about him as Bruce, or I talk about him as Grandpa because it's just weird for me to call him Bruce. But yeah, the letters you'll see sometimes are signed that way, sometimes aren't. Did Grandpa Bruce ever talk about his time in the war when you all were growing up?
I don't think he talked much about it when we were growing up. Of course, Dad was, 15 years, older for you, Lori. There's a 15-year difference between Marty, and so it was
the oldest.
Yeah, it's hard to speak to that exactly. But towards the end of his life, when I'd go up and visit him on Fridays after school, he started opening up more about it. And I remember specifically one time he got a call. He was on the phone for a little while, and when he got off, I asked him, what was that call about? And he said, well, that was someone, I don't remember exactly who wanted to know why he had only flown one mission as a co-pilot. And that's when Dad kind of opened up about Schweingard and talked to me about his first mission was Schweingard, and he said 5 out of 6 of the planes didn't come back, and so there was a big need for no more need for co-pilots, obviously, but a need for pilots, and that's when he became a pilot almost immediately. Flew just the one mission.
Yeah, it's these kinds of family stories, and mixed with the letters, and then mixed with like my personal love of history, and our guest, which I'll introduce here in a minute, that have kind of made me really interested in reading more about his time in the war and learning more about his time in the war. And reading his letters for this podcast, I have learned an awful lot about Grandpa, and more than I knew about him growing up for sure. He died when I was 17, so I didn't get too many years with him, and he definitely did not talk about the war with his grandkids if he didn't talk about it with you all. He mostly supplied us with an endless amount of Faygo Pop and Little Debbie cakes.
The thing I remember, there's one time that I remember he was in the den and he was watching Winds of War, which was a series on World War II. And I just, plopped down, kind of sat there with him, and he got really quiet and he looked over at me and he kind of had tears in his eyes. And I said, what? And he said, I didn't see the war from the ground. I saw the war from the air. So he said, I never thought about the impact that it would have, on the ground. And it was bothersome to him, and obviously probably something reminiscent. There must have been something in that series that triggered, some memories of his too.
Oh,
yeah.
Amazing.
Well, Dad often mentioned that he thought the ground troops had it harder than him because, he got to sleep in a warm bed at night. But after watching Masters of the Air, you realize what the mortality rate was for the B-17 crews, and that's a little different.
Yeah, so that's...
And he let on. He would underplay it because that's how Dad was. But.
And that's a lot of why I'm interested in this project, to find out more about not just the family's history, but then how it intersects with what was going on in Lowell and what is going on in the world, in the war at this time. So that's why we have partnered with Dale Croft, who's a member of the board of directors of the Lowell Historical Museum. And as my dad mentioned at the top of the podcast, he has done an amazing job of digitizing all the Bruce's letters from Aunt Lori's basement. But not only just that, adding the historical context to what was mentioned in Grandpa's letters, which is the key part of this podcast project that we're going to do. So we're happy to welcome Dale as our first ever guest on the Letters Home podcast, and will not be the last.
No,
so welcome to Dale Croft.
Glad to be here. I had a blast doing this. I did over 250 letters digitized, and Bruce's handwriting, when you see that some of the letters is just a piece of art. It
really is.
It's beautiful.
It is
beautiful
great,
handwriting.
Beautiful handwriting.
Anyway, I became interested in it because Mitch and I grew up together.
Tell us.
We graduated in 1970, and he was the quarterback and I was a halfback back in the heyday. And we also played in a band together all the way through junior high and high school, and we also spent many hours on Reservoir Hill playing football with the Joneses and sliding down cardboard boxes on Reservoir Hill on the grass into the circle drive and all kinds of stuff. And over those times, he brought up his dad was a B-17 pilot, and as we got older and a little more mature, he brought up about the letters. And then over time, in the last couple of years, he talked about Lori's basement and the letters and that. I says, wow, man, you got to get those digitized before they get lost, because that's a piece of history that is so precious that, so we had to do it. So that's how I got involved. So,
I think spoken like a true history nerd.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. I grew up reading historical fiction. I didn't like to read, so I read about the Civil War. That's basically all I read is historical fiction. And being a retired teacher for teaching third grade for 26 years, I couldn't think of a better opportunity to work in the Lowell Museum on many of our oral history projects, which we'll talk about. Some of the projects we have going at the museum that preserve the rich history of Lowell. So that's how I got Mitch and I, and have been friends for 70 years.
Yeah, oh
amazing.
My gosh.
That's amazing.
Are we that old?
Well, 68 years, maybe 70 might be pushing it.
Yeah.
But
you went to Catholic school in elementary, so we really didn't connect.
That's
until
eighth grade year.
Oh my goodness. So we have Grandpa's letters, and Dale will talk in a minute how you can actually see them. This is a podcast, so you will get a chance to see his beautiful handwriting and the letters in person. But there's also, like I mentioned, this historical background that goes with it. So, Dale, how did you decide what to include in the historical background? There's probably so much you could have included about World War II, but tell us a little bit.
Well, as I digitized the letters, I would read the letters, I put them in Keynote, and then I would take notes as I read the letters about certain things that Bruce brought up about that time period, 1942, 43, 44, when he was in England, when he was in cadet school, and some of the side trips that he took to, California and all that. And then I would get on the internet and try to find postcards of that time period of places that he went. So I tried to make it look like 1942 or 43, and I found a lot of great information. It was a riot to
It's so
find
cool, so cool.
all that
Yes.
stuff. I mean, and he talked about, he had a great sweet tooth, by the way.
Yes.
So when people
runs
sent
the family.
cookies, chocolate chip cookies, or gum, or whatever, I tried to find, he liked a certain kind of gum, so I tried to find a picture of that kind of gum in 1942 or 43, or anyway, yeah, it was just a lot of fun.
That's awesome.
And I learned so much about Bruce, that I always called Bruce, not James Bruce. So when I first started to digitize the letters, the first ones that came in were James Bruce McMahon. I'm going. So I called Mitch. I went, I think these letters are Bruce's. He goes, no, that's James, right?
Well, he was even called Jim at some
Yeah.
of the stops along
Yeah.
the way for a while, and I could just see him not correcting people for a while. And
So
then-
where did the James come from? Is that James is Frank's brother? Is that why they come to James?
Well, James is
I'm
his
guessing,
first name,
yeah.
his
Well,
real
that's-
first name.
Yes, but Jim was Grandpa's brother,
Right.
so it's kind of a McMahon thing. Kevin is
it?
James
Yeah,
Kevin.
James
and-
Kevin. You
yeah.
told me that.
Mary Marta.
Jim wasn't Dad's brother. Jim was
Grandpa's
Or-
brother.
yeah,
Excuse me.
Grandpa's
Grandpa-
brother. Grandpa Frank's brother.
Jim was
Jim.
his uncle.
Yep, that's
I'm
right.
going to do that a lot. Just
That's
in
okay.
an
That's
ordinance.
okay.
All right.
And I should mention that Dad's letters couldn't really contain any information about the war effort at all. So a lot of it had to be about divinity and what else he was talking about at the
Yeah.
time, because they couldn't reveal anything.
And speak about the
locations.
missions, how you researched the missions
Yeah,
that we
because
didn't
that
know.
really
Oh,
that
yeah.
filled in a lot.
We'll get in that in further episodes because
Okay.
I found where he went to cadet school, the manuals. It was just
Okay.
I learned so much history. I got chills talking
I
about
get
it.
I really want to encourage people to go take a look at it. That's really
Yeah.
Absolutely.
the main reason we're here.
So yeah, tell us where. So we've got this podcast, which is meant to be a bit of a companion to Dale's like visual work that he's mentioning, the letters themselves, the pictures, the primary sources. Dale, tell us a little bit more about where that is going to be, the visual aspect of this, all your hard work.
As I mentioned before, being a retired teacher, I started working with the Lowell Area Historical Museum, which was founded in 1989, and it was founded by a group of members of the community that wanted to have a rich, wonderful history of the Lowell area to preserve it. So they've come up with, over the years, it's almost going to be 40-some years now we've been open. We have 35,000 artifacts in the museum. We're open Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday 1 to 4 if you want to come in and see all the different things. But we have done numerous, 4 or 5 oral history type things. On our webpage, we have oral histories where we've interviewed veterans to participate in World War II, Vietnam, et cetera, and we've interviewed Lowell citizens that tell stories about their Lowell life. We have the very popular ABCs of Lowell, which due to COVID, we had to shut the museum down, and we had to come up with a way to keep the museum in front of people's eyes. And so we've got all kinds of ABCs of Lowell. We did a series called Along Main Street where we did all the historical buildings along Main Street, and you learn about the history of each building, which will have plaques on each building here, I think in another month or so, telling the history of every building on Main Street. We got Letters Home, which will be coming out in July. I just started working on another episode, or another called Remember When, which takes little clips from the newspaper from the late 1800s, and people talk about what Lowell was like back in that time period. So you're going to be able to see this Letters Home on Facebook every Thursday. From Facebook, you'll be able to go to a link to our webpage, which if you go to Collections and Research, You will go down to Letters Home, and then you will go to the year 1942, and there will be a post of the letters and the podcast that you can actually see the visual part of Letters Home as well as listen to the podcast. So, Lowell Museum, lowellmuseum.org. You can go to our website and catch a lot of the stuff we've already got going for us.
That's great. So Dale's going to be a regular guest on the podcast because he's going to be sharing his research and his insights as we go through kind of roughly month by month of Grandpa's time in the war. So this is definitely not the last time we're going to hear from him. He's going to stick around even for our next segment, which is to dig a little deeper into who James Bruce McMahon was. So Dad, why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit.
Let's see. Dad was born in 1915 to Frank J. McMahon and Lotta Sayer. Frank worked for the Lowell Light and Power Company for many years. Dale has he's really found a lot of really cool pictures of Grandpa Frank and his brother Jim and Dad. They all worked at the power company. Anything you want to add to that, Dale? I don't know what.
Well,
About Frank? Great-grandpa Frank?
There was a lot of great things about Frank because my great-grandfather, E.D. McQueen, came into Lowell in 1888, along with Frank and Doc. They called him Doc. He was a veterinarian in Lowell, and he also owned a livery stable. So they did a lot of sports events together. They were referees and umpires and different things there. So in 1896, Frank had a grocery store, and in 1902, he became the superintendent of Lowell Light and Power. At that time,
1902.
1902, he became the superintendent. Okay. There was only 100 customers at that time.
In Lowell, like 100 houses?
Well, 100 customers. I don't know if houses.
I guess houses that had electricity.
There might have been wigwams from the Adawa too. I don't know. I'm not sure. But he started with 100 customers, and in 1952, when he retired after 50 years, he had 2,000 customers. Okay. They had a 75 kilowatt generator, which today would only power one factory in Lowell. And I think
and that was for the whole town.
I'm trying to think that transformer that I showed you with Frank and James on each side of it along the Flat River. That might have been it. He quoted. I love this quote because it was in the paper. It says Frank said, "We worked day and night. The staff included one other man, which probably was James, right? Yeah. James and him always did a lot of the work, and we did everything from checking meters, collecting bills, trouble calls, digging of post holes, and running lines," which your dad brought up, which Bruce brought up in one of the letters telling Frank, you have to stop climbing the poles and running the lines.
You're getting too old for that.
He was in his late 50s, early 60s.
He said he had a lot of energy
still doing
to keep it moving.
He had a park dedicated to him in 1959 up on the Reservoir Hill, which is the McMahon kind of heaven, I guess, up there with the park and they're still up there.
Lori's still there. So
you had the Ritzmas, which you were related to, correct? And then Lori lives up there in the house that your dad built. And Frank built the house that the Ritzmas are in, and then Frank lived there after Lottie passed away, I guess, until Frank passed away. So he was classified as an unselfish service to the community, and he was a great humanitarian. So, he's a well-liked member of the Lowell community.
Yeah, and important as being, the leader of the, electric company. But not just leader, as you mentioned, literally doing all the parts.
He did a lot of showboat stuff with a showboat and all kinds of stuff.
Dad must have been working there when he joined up, right? I think so.
Yeah.
I'm thinking. Dad was a multi-sport athlete. He played football for Lowell High School, Michigan State, Central Michigan, mostly as a fullback. He actually was a quarterback for Michigan State, but that's a little misnomer because all he did was hand the ball off. There wasn't any passing back then. But he's a state champion pole vaulter. He's a talented musician. He traveled to resort towns in the summer to play saxophone and other instruments with the Jerry Schroden Orchestra. He played with Glendon Swardhout, who was maybe most famous resident of Lowell. And like we just said, he worked with his dad at the municipal plant.
Okay, hey, Dad also then married my mom, Margaret Allen, and we'll reveal some of her letters during the podcast project as well. And they met sometime during World War II. Bruce and Margaret had 6 of us, Marty, Mike, Susan, Mitch, Kevin, and me, Lori, the baby. And they have, or they had 14.
14, did I miscount?
Well, that's okay. 13 while Dad was alive, 14 grandchildren, and more than 20 great-grandchildren, although they were born after both of them had passed away. My mom died in 1991, and my dad died in 1998 at the age of 83.
Yeah, so we didn't have an opportunity to interview Grandpa for this project. That would have been amazing. So
I
this
know.
is definitely not an oral history, as Dale mentioned that the museum does a lot. So we're doing a lot of interpretation as to what he might have been thinking or feeling during that time based on the historical evidence, the letters that he has. So in this podcast, Bruce's story is going to begin in 1942 when he was enlisted in the Army to fight in the war. He was 26 years old in 1942, which to me seemed on the older side for a World War II soldier, but and Grandpa wasn't married at 26, which I guess at the time was maybe unusual. I don't know. It seems, and he seemed to be still living with his parents at the time, which we'll talk about. And so I'm curious, like, what else do you know about from his younger days? So it could be, Dale, what do you know from his research before the war, or what do you all know from, family lore about him?
Well,
what was he doing in the early 20s?
up at Central Michigan, where Mitch and I went to college, he was in a group called the Thulians, Thulians.
That was at Central?
Yeah, it was a group of, that had kind of like a fraternity type thing. What else? Oh, the coach was
Ron Finch.
Finch, who was
the Finch Fieldhouse?
Yeah, Finch Fieldhouse. He was a teacher here. And just after Bruce graduated, and that's how Bruce got up there along with Jack Lally. Jack Lally and Bruce went up together and played football together for the Bearcats. Did you know?
Fire up.
Did you know Central was called the Bearcats back when your dad went to school?
Not when you went to school, right?
No.
When
we were-
Grandpa went to school.
Yeah.
No, I did know. I'm a Central alum as well. Fire up.
Yeah.
I think we all are on
Fire up, Chips.
on this table.
Yeah.
Fire up Bearcats.
Dad was his senior class president at CMU before he was before he went to war.
Yeah.
And he went to war. He went to war before the end of that.
It was
year.
pretty much just Warner Hall and the ROTC building. And he used to pheasant hunt where the library is now. I remember him telling us.
Oh,
that.
really?
Yeah, so.
Oh my
The
God.
cabin was there, though.
Yeah.
That bar was still there? Was
Yes,
there and-
was there when Dad was there, yes.
Oh, so he went to Central up until he was roughly about 26 or so, is what you were saying,
Yeah.
Aunt Lori?
About 1930.
He went to state first, I think.
They went
I'll have
state
to look at
first
the.
and
I'll have to
Central.
look at the yearbook. I'll have to give you the yearbook because I have his CMU yearbook.
We have a yearbook?
And he mentions Western State, although I don't know that he ever attended Western or
Central.
I don't.
Listen, if you went to Central, which we all did, you know that sometimes once a year you go to Western to partake in a rivalry
Yes.
football game.
Oh,
Maybe
very
that's
well.
what it was.
So maybe they're frequent visits.
Well, he was featured in the sports page up there many times. There's some great pictures of him as a
Pole vault?
fullback. He was
Oh.
the fullback, and there's you'll see in the media part. There's some pictures of him in the first few episodes of him as a star of the Central football
Well,
team.
Lori, do you have any of those Grand Rapids press clippings? Because there were
I do.
quite a few of him at Central. He'd get a nice write-up.
Yeah.
I do. If I go backwards, though, but if I think about, because you said in his younger days, and I think about high school, because he set the high school pole vault record when he was in high school, and
With a bamboo pole.
with a bamboo pole, and they went into sand. He pole vaulted into sand. Sometimes he
Wow.
said sawdust on occasion, but mainly sand, and it didn't feel good. He said.
No. Well,
So-
at least he wasn't dropping from 26 feet. He was.
11, I think is what it was. And then he did play against Jerry Ford when in high school.
I didn't know that.
Played against Jerry Ford in high school football. East Grand Rapids versus Lowell. Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
Yep. And there's a picture. We were talking about the Frank McMahon Park, Grandpa Frank's Park. Yeah, I have pictures of Grandpa Frank with Jerry Ford there, and
Yeah.
yeah,
But I
and
didn't
letters.
realize that Grandpa Bruce played against him in football. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's always fun to hear about his high school days,
I-
his college days.
I come across some of his junior high days too, and
Oh.
I got basketball pictures. He played tennis. He's handsome.
yeah, that's
He was
right.
a handsome young little guy.
Quite an athlete.
Yeah,
He was
yes,
little.
he was.
Yeah.
He was a busy guy.
There was
Like
just
being on
a mention of him as one of the tennis players in Lowell
Yeah.
he was in the Ledger the other day.
Jack Lally and him were always in the pictures together, and they went on. They
First
went,
cousins,
They
yeah.
went to war together too.
Yeah,
They
we'll
went off
talk
to
about.
war
We'll,
together. So we'll get to
hear
that.
more about Jack
Yep.
Lally for sure in this
Yep.
project. Well, the Ledger reported on February 19th, 1942. That was when Grandpa went to enlist for World War II at a recruitment event in Grand Rapids. And the Ledger reported, so this was in the newspaper, that he failed his eye exam in the morning, then went back in the afternoon on the same day and passed his eye exam. So he had to have cheated, yes? Like, I have to imagine, because I don't know how that's possible.
I heard he memorized it. I
Or
heard
like
he-
that's what, yeah, but he had to have done this.
He
right?
was very worried about that eye test for many months. Again, without good eyesight, he wouldn't have been able to get into the Air Corps,
Yeah,
and he really wanted that. So
yeah. So he was that worried about it. He had to.
I think he asked somebody else to memorize it and tell him what it was so that he could do it.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I never remember him having like bad eyesight though. As
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess I knew him more when he was a lot
It was
older.
a
but
stigmatism, just a slight
just a slight issue, right?
stigmatism. Yes.
Well, so he enlists in February 1942, and you mentioned he wanted to be in the Air Corps, right?
Yep.
That was, I think, because Grandpa had his private pilot's license right around this time. Like, so the
know
Ledger
that.
also mentioned that he was through the civilian pilot training program, which, through some of my research, was just Googling. I'm not as into it as Dale is. It was a government-funded program to get more civilians their pilot license so that we would kind of have more readily available pilots when we did get into the war eventually. It was a way to get people sort of military training without officially like being in the war yet.
Was it created as a result of Pearl Harbor, or don't you know?
Well, before. But it was created
before.
when
Okay.
when World War II started in Europe.
Okay.
We were not yet involved, but obviously as this big war is going on, our government must have said we should just probably get ready just in case. So from 1938 to 1944, there were over 400,000 people got their pilot's license, civilians, through this program, and then they later joined the Army as pilots. But I suppose you could have not joined the Army, I guess, and just flown planes. But this is apparently quite a famous program. As I was looking into it more, they really targeted college students, which would have been like Grandpa at the time, right? And they accepted women, which was rare at the time, and black pilots. And so I guess the Tuskegee Airmen were part of this program. So I mean, I think this is absolutely what this tracks with Grandpa's age and what he might have been into at the time. And of course, he started the war in 1942 in flight training, which we'll talk about in the next few episodes. And he ended up flying 38 missions in his B-17. And his story in this podcast is about his adventures flying. As Aunt Lori mentioned, like, he didn't experience the war on the ground. He experienced the war in the air. So a lot of this is going to be about his time in the plane. But I knew Grandpa was a pilot in the war because that's been sort of like family stories, but I didn't really put it together that he could have and maybe did fly like commercial planes. That would have been how he got started. So I don't know, what did you all know about
I
him
didn't
as a
know that.
pilot?
I'm learning right now.
Right now, right this minute. Did you ever fly with him? Did he fly after the war? Like, was this literally just like a war thing?
I know after the war, after he did, he's kind of declassification. He was in charge of that out in New Mexico. I don't remember out, and he had to wait a while to get out. But he used to fly B-17s to different areas after the war for supplies and stuff.
Oh, okay.
some of that kind of thing.
And I don't know whose plane he flew when he got here, but I thought, is it Gouldy Rivette? Rivette's, I don't know if he had a plane.
Oh, Gooley flew.
Okay, so I think Dad might have flown his plane sometimes because he dropped letters to Mom. He dropped letters to Reservoir Hill, and dropped some things
I think
there.
that's when he was flying those the cargo planes and the
Yeah,
B-17s
right.
around, and he would have a chance to just take a detour.
He would do drive-bys, flybys.
Well,
Yeah.
he dropped flowers to Mom at Reservoir Hill once.
One of his jobs at one time, and I don't remember the exact time, but he would get the B-17s right off the assembly line, and we'd fly them somewhere.
Oh,
Go.
okay.
So, yeah. Gooley, a little story on Gooley Rivette, which he was a wild kind of guy, a great guy, but he was somebody that flew his plane underneath the railroad bridge at
Yes,
one time.
that I heard that.
And
I
he
remember.
flew his plane down Main Street at one time back in the heyday.
And I
Oh, yeah.
heard that too.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah. He was great. He had a cottage out on Murray Lake, and he built his own sailboat out there. And he used to come by and pick me up at our dock. Yeah, we had some. He was on the wild side.
That's a whole other podcast, I
he's
think.
a very good, very animated character.
In each episode of this podcast, we're going to be covering a part of Bruce's life in the war chronologically. And as I mentioned above, his story starts in February 1942 when he enlisted. So we're going to kind of talk about first what was going on in the world in World War II in early 1942. So, Aunt Lori, give us a history lesson.
Well, it began in 1939 when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland. The U.S. remained neutral in the war, even though it was not so subtly trained pilots through the Civil Pilot Training Program. The United States entered the war on December 7th, 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
In April of 1942, the first Japanese internment camps opened, where the government arrested Japanese immigrants and detained them throughout the war. The Japanese Army took over the Philippines, where Japanese soldiers forced Filipinos and U.S. POWs to march 65 miles in what was called the Bataan Death March. Anywhere from 5,000 to 19,000 people died on the trek, although the United States did not know about this tragic event until years later.
Yeah, so early 1942, we have the U.S. just entering the war, right? Do you think Pearl Harbor, which was just a couple months before this, motivated Grandpa to enlist in the war?
It just seems like one of those questions I should have asked him. I mean, that would just been a logical question to ask him, and I never did. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, there was something that was really motivating because he didn't finish that senior year at Central.
That's right.
So he went right. He was in school, and he went and went right.
There were many members of the Lowell community that joined in forces of the Navy. You had Mike and King Doyle. You had Mr. Wisner, who was shot down in his P-38. So a lot of these guys that graduated in the mid-30s, they all went on to fight for the war. I'm sure Pearl Harbor had a big reason for
Yeah,
it.
that would be.
In addition to talking about what was going on in the world in 1942, in each of our episodes, we're going to highlight what might have been going on in Lowell at the time. So, Dale, what do you know about life in Lowell in early 1942 or at the start of World War II?
Well, like many civilians all across the U.S., a lot of people started victory gardens where they grew their own produce and to stretch rations. They had scrap drives that were held to collect household goods made of rubber and aluminum to provide materials for the defense industry. Of course, the ration books, I think we've all seen those. At least I think there was a few in for gas and food. Some people were trained in first aid, aircraft spotting, because they were worried about the Japanese coming on California side, bomb removal, firefighting, and of course, women went to work in the factories with the famous poster of
Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah. Many purchased war bonds. That was the big thing as I looked through articles during that time. Many of the businesses had great big ads in the ledger supporting the war bonds. E-bonds, they were called. And then boys and girls contributed tons of material for ammunition, bombs, and military vehicles. That's what they could do. There's also a group in Lowell called the Gallants, Gallants, was a group of people that 30 or 40 people got together to sell e-bonds. They were called the Gallants in Lowell.
A local group.
My grandfather was one of them. Bruce was part of that group, 30, 40 of them. So that's, it was just sacrifice. Rations cut short, food was cut down, gas cut down, tires on cars. You couldn't get tires on cars. They talked about
That happens in.
Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, Bruce talked about that when Lottie and Frank
Yep,
came out. They had to
visit.
he worried about having tires and enough tires to get them out and the whole rigmarole. It was, it's just a fantastic story.
He
So,
does talk about saving his,
Yep.
clothes,
Right.
civilian clothes, recycling them. So yeah, a lot of attention to that
Yep.
for sure. Yeah, so we do know that on April 9th, 1942, the Lowell Ledger reported that Grandpa Bruce was reporting to Santa Ana Air Force Base in California for flight school. So this is where we're going to pick up his story in the next episode. That's all for us today. Thank you for listening to Letters Home. We hope you continue to listen as we go through Bruce's story. You can listen to Letters Home on the Lowell Historical Museum website or on Spotify. The Lowell Historical Museum has a digitized version of Grandpa's letters, so you can read them in full, along with primary sources for most of the people, places, and events we've talked about here today. You can also follow the Lowell Historical Museum on Facebook and the Letters Home podcast on Instagram at Letters Home Lowell. See you next time.